Welcome. This is the third in our series on European and North American approaches to human rights. Today's topic is religious freedom and secularism. The group today is a result of a terrific collaboration on campus. European Studies, has sponsored much of this. This colloquium is behind actually all parts of this collaboration, which is really nice, but so are a lot of people. So I'm just going to say a word about that, and I want to recognize Douglas Bio, who is here and is the director of European Studies. He has, European Studies has funded a number of terrific projects on campus, and one of them is an exchange program with École des Hautes Études and Sciences Sociales, and you can tell French is not one of the languages I speak, so we call that the EHESS arrangement collaboration that's headed by Ben Brouwer, who is also here today and has been quite involved. There he is, and has worked with Sofiane Marabet in that project. So thank you all. That's to say that they have invited one of our speakers, Sonia Dayan-Herzbrun, to participate in their program, and it's because of that that we're very fortunate to have her with us. We're also grateful to Middle Eastern Studies, Karen Wilkins, who's the director, and I don't know if she's here, and Jeanette Oker, who is responsible for the invitation to Hilal Elver, which really got things going for this collaboration. Hilal is also speaking tomorrow as a part of a program in Middle Eastern Studies. We're also grateful to the South Asia Institute. Kamran Ali, the director, is here. Thank you, Kamran. And the Historical Institute, and Seth Garfield is the director of that. So you can see a lot of people have gone into making this event happen today. This event, as those of you who have participated in other aspects of it know, this is part of a class that I teach, and usually the seminar students are sitting around the table, but we're all in this room today, so they're in the first few rows, and as always, they get a chance to ask the first few questions. They have spent a lot of time reading the work of our guest speakers today, and have a lot of questions. They've written papers, and I'll say a word about what we've read, although the speakers are going to speak to everyone who has and has not read. We have three incredibly distinguished speakers today, and if I can't even begin to give you their biographies, so I'll give you a few highlights and those that particularly relate to the discussion we're going to have today on religious freedom and secularism. So Sonia Dayan-Herzbrun is a sociologist by training, is also a philosopher, and is Emeritus Professor at the University of Paris. She's author or editor of at least, I counted 11 books and dozens of articles in a wide range of areas, including Greek philosophy, Marxism, feminism, aesthetics, and Middle Eastern politics. Since 1999, she has co-directed a seminar on gender relations in the Middle East and North Africa at the EHESS, and that's a part of the collaboration. Relevant to the discussion today, she's chair of the Commission on Islam and Secularism in France. For the class, we read an article she wrote in 2000 called The Issue of the Islamic Headscarf. It was actually a chapter in a book entitled Women, Immigration, and Identities in France. She'll talk a bit about the issues raised there, but put them in a broader context of laïcité in France, and also talk about Islamophobia and a number of recent events. Hilal Elver is a legal academic and is research professor in global studies and co-director of the project on climate change, human security, and democracy at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And she's also taught at the Ankara University School of Law. She is Turkish, was appointed by the Turkish government to serve as founding legal advisor of the Ministry of Environment, and she's published a great deal on international environmental law, human rights, and women's rights. Her most recent book is what she'll focus on today. It's entitled The Headscarf Controversy, Secularism and Freedom of Religion, and it was published by Oxford University Press in 2012. For class, we read 2 chapters from the book, one on the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights with regard to the headscarf, and particularly with cases in Turkey and France. And she'll be speaking from and about and around the work in those chapters. After the 2 of them speak, we'll hear from Richard Falk, who is Albert Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law and Practice at Princeton University and visiting Distinguished Professor in Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is and has been one of the most prolific and distinguished scholars of international law for the past 40 years. I had to stop counting his books. I think there were 22, but he has quite a few to his name and many, many, many more articles. Since 2008, he has also served as UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, and he's winding up his term there. His interests are also wide-ranging, including philosophy and theology in addition to law. And for class, we read part of his book entitled Religion and Humane Global Governance, which does give you a sense of his breadth. And even though the book was on religion, we read the chapter on secularism, which is what he suggested for our discussion today. So he will comment a bit on the previous 2 speakers in terms of laicite and secularism in France and Turkey, and we'll contrast that and compare it, I suppose, to the history of secularism in the United States. So he'll be our U.S. representative for today. Please join me in welcoming these speakers. And we begin with Sonia. And I'll just say they'll each speak for about 15 minutes. Then we'll have a conversation among them, and then we'll open it up more broadly to the audience.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you. And thank you, and thank everybody to be here. I'm very happy to be among you. Well, I shall speak of the French situation and in my bad English, so please do excuse me. Well, the title of my presentation is Laïcité or Laïcité. I don't use the word secularism because it's not exactly the same. I shall try to explain that. So, ex-laïcité ou laïcité and Islamophobia. Of course, anti-Muslim racism is nowadays a very common feeling in most of non-Muslim countries. But my purpose today is to try to show how laïcité, which has been invented in France to protect religious freedom, has become, in its new interpretation, the instrument of Islamophobia, and what is the extent of this phenomenon now deep, now which is a deep-rooted feeling in my country. It's something I find very sad. So first, just a few words about France and laïcité. I don't know how much you know about France, and France is a very peculiar situation in Europe. It's not Europe, it's a part of Europe, but it's not Europe at all. Well, it's Europe, but the situation is quite different from the situation of other European countries. So, what laïcité from the end of the 17th century, where we had the abolition of the Edit de Nantes at the end of the 17th century, to the French Revolution in 1789, the only religion authorized in France was the Roman Catholic one. Since the Middle Age, you know perhaps that, France has been known as the elder daughter of the Church. Of course, the church was the Roman Catholic Church. But as the modern state became stronger and stronger, the state maintained a strict control upon religion. So we say generally that we had in France a sort of Catholicism which we call Gallicanism. So it's the Catholic religion, but under the control of the state. And it was the main work of our King Louis XIV. So laïcité put an end to that. And that we at the moment of course of the revolution. The first point is the Article 10 of the Declaration of the Human and Citizen Rights. And this article can be considered as the first stage of laicization. This article states, a quotation translated in English, "No one can be troubled for his opinions, even religious ones, provided that their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by the law." And that was really a real revolution in France, where you could only be a Catholic, or when you were not Catholic, it was very, very dangerous for you. So this article meant, of course, first, freedom of religion, that everybody knows, but also equality between citizens, and that's very important, between citizens considered as individuals only related to the nation state. This point is very important and it must be underlined. One of the main features of republic and republicanism in France, and republic and republicanism are the heart or the core of the French national identity. So one of the main features of republic and republicanism in France is the assertion that the only accepted community is the nation. This was acted by a famous law. I'm not a lawyer, but laws are important. The famous law named Loi Le Chapelier from 1791, which dissolved all the guilds. And since then, every association was controlled until now by the state. I stress this point because, in fact, one of the biggest accusations against the Muslims is that they are communitarists. They are against this principle, this republican principle, and they are accused of communitarism, of constituting communities out of the nation unity. They are breaking the national unity of France. And that because, for example, women don't wear, they don't wear like the French women, or because they don't share the same rules for eating. That was the first moment. The second moment, but when the principles were founded. The second moment of laicization of the country was marked by the famous law that you probably know of 1905. This law contained articles about religious freedoms, that was a free exercise of cult, I don't know the name, and what's the word in and worship, and about separation between churches and state. That meant that churches, but then we had the church as a plural, that meant that churches could not interfere in public affairs, but also that state had to be neutral and to be the warrant of religious freedom without interfering in the religious realm. So that was the spirit of this fundamental law. The threat of the influence of the external power of the Catholic Church, mainly through its schools, was progressively outcasted. Even in France, remained and still is framed by a secularized Catholic culture. The main issue about laicity was the question of schools, with an ongoing quarrel between public, that means state schools, which were secular, and private religious schools. But this question was solved in 1984, and since that completely laid aside. At this point, I want to make two remarks. First remark, until this period, the principle of laicité applied only to institutions or to groups, but never to individuals. And that's changed completely. Second point, even in 1905, about 20 million of Muslims lived in the French colonial empire. And even if there have been already 250,000 North African workers employed in France during the First World War, because the workers were on the front, and so we imported North African workers, and there were also as well North African soldiers, so there were already many Muslims on the French ground. Islam was not included in the landscape. Islam was invisible. That's this question of visibility and invisibility, which is also very important. Whereas, but on the contrary, for example, in Algeria, laïcité has been used against the Muslim natives to exclude a large part of them from citizenship. Not all of them, a large part of them, creating a division. So I make a big jump. All that changed at the end of the 80s of last century, when the Muslims became visible. Once suddenly, one saw a lot of Muslims, not so many, but quite some of them in the streets, in the schools, with the issue of the Islamic scarf. Before, of course, there were Muslims, but they were in the what we call bidonville, periphery, but we never saw them. Since then, the dress codes of girls and women had become a major national concern, as strange as that may appear when you consider it from outside with a cold eye. Laïcité was and still is put forward and used first against freedom of religion, but that meant freedom of only one religion, that is Islam. For the other religion, there is no problem. Then against individuals, and that was completely different, and individuals, especially girls and women, so against girls and women, but in order, they said, to protect them. And then we had this law of, we had two laws. The law of March 2014, 10 years ago, and another law in 2010 for the niqab, to ban the niqab. So with these two laws, something appeared very new, that I call state Islamophobia. It was something decided by the state. In contradiction with what the law of 1905 established, which was the neutrality of the state. So then, individuals were ordered to be neutral. They had to be neutral, and not the state to be neutral. It was a complete shift. And that was also a complete shift from the principle of equality, because we had exceptional law applying to only a part of the French population and not to all the French population. So that's the whole of French population was no more equal in front of the law. Well, and what I shall try to tell also is that if this state Islamophobia is possible, it's because it rests on a popular Islamophobia, and so the state Islamophobia is accepted and even denied, because it's not perceived as Islamophobia. So the individuals were ordered to be neutral, and also the so-called public space. And nobody knows what is public space, but this public space is supposed to be neutral. And so we have now a sort of new laïcité. My friend, the sociologist Jean Bobéro, calls that a falsified, false laïcité, but that's what we have at this moment. A lot of things have been said and written about this issue and still have to be said. There are a lot of things that have not been still deeply enough analyzed. But for the other part of my presentation, I want to focus on the question of Islamophobia, which arose at this period, at the beginning, at the beginning of the 20th century. Islamophobia has become in France what I call a real world view, what in German is Weltanschauung, with a lot of aspects and consequences. Well, first, in France, we have a controversy about the use of this word Islamophobia, because some people still say that there is only some anti-Arab or anti-Muslim racism, but not Islamophobia. But I think it's a very important word, because what means Islamophobia? It means at the same time a threat, Islam as a threat, and Islam as an object of hatred. So it's quite different. I have an example with the scare, the laws, the problem of the veiled nannies. There are all sorts of stories about the women who take care of children and who wear headscarves. Nobody thinks that they wear headscarves outside, but when they are at home with the babies, of course they don't. But they're supposed to scare babies who don't see their ears. You have all sorts of stories, but they are supposed not to feed the baby because they have to pray, and when they have to pray, they don't feed the baby. So, but you have a lot of stories, stupid stories, but which you hear that on the state radio from real specialists, people who are psychoanalysts, or people who are supposed to have to think a little bit, and they don't think at all when it comes at this point. So that is quite different from the ordinary anti-Arab racism, which has been quite common in France, along with all sorts of racism. The anti-Arab racism has been condemned by leftist parties and activists who fought against it. But the same left expresses often its hostility against Islam as a religion. it is not the Muslim people who are directly the targets of this new type of racism, it is their religion. If they behave as secularized Christian people, if they don't wear headscarves or, oh, I have so many things still to say, or even headbands, or if they eat pork, if they drink wine, if they don't fast on Ramadan, and better, if they criticize their own religion, it's okay. But of course, they could also better change their first names. First names are also a big problem. So then they have no problem. I'll take a few minutes, please. So, second point, Islamophobia can be defined as a secular ideology and observed then as three levels. It's an ideology because it conceals the reality of the French people. About 10% of the French people are Muslims, and then they are Muslims settled in France since sometimes 4 or 5 generations. So, and it defends the purity not of biological race, of course, but of republican tradition. And it's, for me, it's a symptom of a tension between republic and democracy. So, what are, according to me, the 3 areas where Islamophobia can be easily observed? First, in the interactions inside small groups, colleagues, friends, acquaintances, Islamophobic discourse and attitudes, the first, of course, about the veil, attitude, jokes, cartoons, create consensus, allow connivance, complicity in front of Islam or in front of Muslims who display their beliefs. And when you are not a part of this consensus, it is very difficult to maintain a proper social life outside very small circles. Then it is observed also in the definition of political identities, particularly of national identity. The Republican reference, as I said, is typically French with all the connotations I tried to suggest a few minutes before, and is preferred to the democratical principle. As left and right parties refer to the same identities, it created recently a huge confusion between them, and that's very dangerous on a political level because everything gets confused. Well, another level, it's on, of course, the way international relations are addressed. Islamophobia is used as a framework to interpret events going on in the world with all the stereotypes and the shortcuts you can imagine. In everyday life, it is as if a veiled mother was already a potential terrorist planning to bomb something. But actually, she is the one who is the victim of violences in the streets, physical violences, the one who can't find a work, the one who is not allowed to accompany the class of her daughter or son when they go out for some visit organized by the school. But because that's also not a law, but a circular. It's the veiled mothers are not allowed to go with the children when the children go out with their class. So I focused on women because they are specially targeted by all these laws recently voted and perhaps still going to be voted in the name of laïcité. Of course, I could have mentioned the other issues where men are also concerned, the food, halal food, the fast, there are no mosques, there are problems about cemeteries and various discrimination. But what is going on with overtly Muslim women and the use of this falsified laicity against Islam appears as a renewed episode of what Marnia Lazreg, in her beautiful book, but is not translated in French, The Eloquence of Silence, analyzed as a competition of patriarchies. So I wanted to develop this point, but I just want to point out a connection between what is going on in France nowadays and its colonial past, which is the hidden face of Republic. And if Republic is the pretext for this politics, it's also because the French Republic was a colonial republic. Thank you very much. I hope I have not been too long.
First of all, I also would like to thank all the institutes and the centers and the individuals, specifically Karen Engel and Janet Okur, that they invited me here to be with you and talking about my book and a little bit of general secularism and headscarf issues in relation to Turkey. The book is about not only Turkey, it's a kind of a comparative perspective I try to give, which was important looking at from the comparative perspective. When I was writing this book, I was always, because I'm Turkish and I lived many years in Turkey, the headscarf controversy is part of my life in generational, even starting with my mother. And in this sense, there was a personal interest at writing this book, but I never thought that this is going to be an important case. And I was always expecting this case is going to be over and nothing really serious. It's going to be die down in Turkey, not trouble the other countries. I was wrong. I was really wrong. Even if I was writing this book, I said when I publish this book, there will not be any headscarf controversy. Why I am doing this? I am very wrong. The reason is because I think the headscarf is the symbol of many things right now in our society. The headscarf is a symbol of Islam, that's the simple way, but headscarf it became a security issue after September 11, and headscarf became a power politics in many countries. For instance, in my country, headscarf is the fight between or among the political parties. And the headscarf is sociologically very important because divides the societies, especially societies like Turkey. And in this sense, it's a very important, it carries a symbolism, or more importantly, the perspective of the gender is there, of course, the most importantly, but very strangely, actually, from the wrong perspective. We basically Westerners and many seculars in Turkey look at the headscarf case as a kind of domination of women and the sort of diminishing of women's identity, but they never look at, from the other perspective, empowerment of women and an identity issue, and at the same time, serious discrimination against women. But the reason is in Turkey, especially in Turkey, I don't know other countries are like that, the religious families are religious altogether, men, women, and children. But nothing happens to husbands and the boys, but the girls and the wives are the sacrificing lamb because they can't get any position. They are always blamed as a religious person, but their husbands become even president or prime minister or very important position. This made me extremely concerned about this headscarf issue because the differences between the gender is striking. Unfortunately, it is not really much discussed, especially in the court cases. And basically in this book, I try to look at the cases from the perspective of the judicial system. Basically, I looked at the Turkish Constitutional Court decisions and European Court of Human Rights decisions about headscarf, which include basically Turkey, many cases about Turkey, because Turkey is member of the European Court of Human Rights. And I looked at the case Switzerland and France and also Germany. Germany is also a special case because it is not part, there is no cases in the European Court of Human Rights, but the German Constitutional Court has a very interesting case. That's why it should not be really sort of looked down. As you, Sonia, said that France is different than the rest of the Europe. It is yes and no. What I feel or what I sort of see, French talks, acts more enthusiastically and more openly, but the other countries are doing even worse things, but more simple and less noisy way. If you look at what's happening in Germany, I don't think so it is worse than France, even sometimes even much further, but we always see the laïcité is the place of France. That's why we sort of connect with the headscarf cases in relation to laïcité. That's why France is very important. France is very important in the case of Turkey too, because Turkey took the principle of laïcité almost completely similar to French case. The Turkey, the earlier, at the beginning of the 20th century, when the Ottoman Empire dismantled and the Turkey became Republic of Turkey, and they needed somehow to sort of eliminate the Islam and Islamic culture, which is 500 years, and Sharia law, and they wanted to be modern and Western and European. And in this process, they changed several of laws. All of them are European legal system. Completely, there is nothing in Turkish legal system closer to Sharia law, Islamic law, which includes the family law. In this case, Turkey is the only country in the world, 95% of Muslim, but they don't have any relationship with Islamic law. That's the only one example. And the secularism or laïcité, what we call laiklik, is the perfectly good concept for Turkey to accept, because they want to get rid of the religion, and the French did same thing against the Catholic Church. But interestingly enough, the difference is that Turkey is, especially after the Republic period, completely not a monocultural society. As I said, 95-96% of Muslim. It's not like we don't have a Protestants and the Catholics that we can make certain kind of balance. But what we did, what the state wanted to do, control the religion, teach the religion on the banner of the government, and when they teach the religion, kind of Sunni Islam version of religion should be controlled by state, then they can control the society. It's a kind of different type of maybe laïcité, completely different than secularism. What I call authoritarian laïcité, which controlling the society, nothing to do with kind of like a freedom of religion. And actually, if you look at the Turkish constitution, what is surprising, that there are several of articles, and the preambles are full of sentences about laïcité, importance of laïcité, very little word about the freedom of religion or individual human rights. Very kind of, it's a striking constitution that makes society control. Of course, you would say, oh, this constitution written by the military in 1980s, but still we have the same constitution despite many of the changes, but this secularity principles is not changeable. It's non-changeable article. That's why it's there are still dealing about this issue. This is the background. If we come to the headscarf cases, in Turkey, the problem started 1980s during the Cold War period. And few of the students started to wear headscarf in the universities, and this was the time that the religion was rather a little bit of benign character, because the enemy was communism. There was no big deal in the world, but there was a big deal in Turkey because military is extremely secular, and they were controlling the society. In this sense, we had several of cases in Turkey, and hundreds of thousands of students left the university. They were not able to go. You can't go to the high school anyway, but university should be a kind of free place after age of 18. But in Turkey, actually, was the only country not allowing the students at the university. Many of the cases are about the student cases. Actually, interestingly, now the president of Turkey, right now he's actual president, his wife, also one of the victims of this, and she went to the European Court of Human Rights when her husband became foreign minister. She has to take her case back. I'm trying to say how interesting in Turkey, part of the European Court of Human Rights and headscarf, some kind of, there was an important system there. And this major case, which you read, kind of medical school students that was expelled from the medical school because she was wearing headscarf, became an important case because it became the not grand jury, but the what they called? The
Grand Chamber.
Grand Chamber, Grand Chamber. And the decision was very, very important in the world, but it was not important in Turkey. Everyone was expecting the decision is going to come like this because many of the cases were exactly ended like the Leyla Şahin case. It was not a big deal in Turkey, but the big deal was, this was in 2005. Until 2002, in Turkey, we did have a very secular governments. But after 2002, the political structure gradually changed in Turkey, and the governing party is AKP, or Justice and Development Party, is I would say, Muslim-friendly conservative party. And they were, at that time, government. But the case, of course, started the earlier period. When the European Court of Human Rights case came against headscarf use, that was very, very important because the government was different right now. This was a kind of important changing from the political perspective. Why this decision came, there are lots of details, and I don't want to go to details if you ask me a question-answer period, but the court really made its routine cases like they did other cases in it's about Article 9, freedom of religion. As you know, freedom of religion is not a limitless, they have a limit. First, they look at whether or not the case is against the freedom of religion. Yes, her right, the freedom of religion right was preached by the Turkish government. The court first time accepted this. This was important. But in the second process, which is Article 9-2, limitation of the freedom of religion, court came very strongly and very almost politically against the headscarf, using the secularism, laicite principles exactly in the Turkish setting, and Moreover, they talk about the political Islam, danger of the political Islam. That's why this case is important, because fundamentalism is a dangerous way in Turkey. And they also talk about rather than protecting an individual's freedom of religion, they said, well, actually, we have to look at the students that they don't use headscarf. We have to protect them because the peer pressure is very important. Then we should not really allow, actually court, instead of making the decision, refer the Turkish system, which is generally European Court of Human Rights, makes this a kind of issue, especially in relation to culture and religion. They don't want to make too much kind of controversial, and they refer to the domestic law, and they refer to the domestic law. They said Turkish Constitutional Court doesn't allow, then we're going to follow this. But this decision by Turkish judicial system interpreted even more comprehensively, like, okay, we can't anymore do any more law. We cannot change anything. There is no way in Turkey you cannot use any more headscarf, because judiciary also, just like the military, is extremely secular in Turkey. As opposed to government. Of course, used to be government also very secular, but now there is a division. If you follow the Turkish politics recently, these divisions become even more complicated. Divisions also now is among the governing party and the other Islamic groups. It's getting more complicated. But the most recent decision in Turkish Constitutional Court, also very interesting, because I think 2007, 2008, the Constitutional Court members has been changed. They have the new members right now, more government-friendly. You can understand the politics of it. And this government-friendly Constitutional Court made a decision in 2012 saying that, well, secularism principle doesn't mean that you have to get rid of religion from the public space. And now it's changing. As you see, the culture is changing, legal system accordingly is changing now. In Turkey, there is no headscarf problem, basically, but not legally. Just changing the decrees and regulations rather than laws, because they had to change constitutional law, because there is no law against headscarf in Turkey since early period of Turkey, because extremely political way, because 65% women in Turkey are using headscarf, one reason or another. If more than 50% women are using headscarf in a country, obviously it's not a good idea to completely ban the headscarf with the law. What they do kind of like a regulatory system to get rid of students from the university, get rid of students from the civil servant, get rid of people to become a judge and lawyer or university professors. These things are changing right now, but very slowly. And there's also backlash. I am expecting the backlash because there is no law. And when this government, if this government lose the power and the seculars come to power, the first thing, they're going to fire all women wherever they are. They're going to lose everything because from the legal perspective, very precarious case. Let me stop here, and in the question-answer period, we can go more. Thank you.
Let me also thank the sponsors and Karen Engel for bringing us together, and I'm very happy to be part of this panel. I wanted to start by mentioning the two reasons that I've become interested in these kinds of issues. The first reason is that I had long been teaching international law and international relations, and came increasingly to the view that there was a religious resurgence going on around the world that wasn't being reflected in the way in which these subjects were being studied. That there was a real missing part to what was happening in the world, and that the modern science reason way of interpreting political and legal behavior was insufficient. In other words, one can talk about this as saying one needed a postmodern, not in the literary deconstructionist sense, but a postmodern understanding of how political and legal realities are being shaped around the world, and also within the United States. The second basis of my interest was my experience of Turkey over the last 20 years, and particularly this strange kind of set of issues that emerged in Turkey in a way that was so different from my experience in the United States. And the essence of that difference, which follows from what Hilal has just been describing, is that there appeared to be the so-called secular people who were associated with human rights seemed to be saying that the way to help women was to disempower them. It was very perverse that, as has been said, headscarf women were excluded in all sorts of venues in Turkey, and religious men were not. And yet it was said that for the sake of women, it was necessary to ban the headscarf, and therefore make them choose between their religious commitments and the possibility of participating in Turkish society as an equal citizen. And what it led me to understand, and I think it bears more broadly on the subject, was that in the Turkish experience, particularly as articulated by its very influential founder, Kemal Ataturk, there was a sense that to be modern meant to get rid of religion. That part of what had held Turkey back, and it held other countries back, was the influence of religion. And therefore, you had to liberate the society from religion. Now, this doesn't explain why women were the main target of this attitude toward modernity. But it does suggest that there was something deep in the sense of what secularism meant in Turkey, which it never meant in the United States. The United States' understanding of secularism never meant that one needed to get rid of religious influence. It meant rather that one created an atmosphere where religious freedom could flourish and people could pursue their various forms of religious commitment. The other aspect in Turkey, I think, that's very different than the United States is the degree to which the society is aligned in such a way as to put anti-religious, secular political parties opposed to more religiously oriented or friendly political parties, although both sides in this political tension, affirm secularism. Because it is still impossible in the Turkish setting not to accept what Ataturk created for the Republican Turkey. So the sense that being religious is, in a active sense, a threat to the way in which power was deployed in Turkey was something very new to me, and expressed a very special reality. And I think the broader sense of this is that political and historical context determine the character of secularism, the character of the relationship between religion and the state in a modern society, and that the American experience in this regard was very much both shaped by trying to learn from the mistakes that it found had happened in Europe. That America didn't want, in its early period, either religious persecution or religious wars. Those were the two experiences in Europe that had seemed to be instructive in identifying how best to regulate the relationship between religion and the state and the formation of a state. So that learning from Europe was learning the mistakes of Europe was one issue. Another issue was during the colonial America, there were several things that became very prominent. One was the degree to which many of the colonial communities were basically escaping from religious persecution, and religious persecution in a European context. So the centrality of ensuring religious freedom was something that was very fundamental to the early American experience. At the same time, there was emerging in this colonial period the sense that there wasn't just one religion. There wasn't there was no way to preserve religious freedom and avoid persecution without making sure that the state was neutral in relation to specific identifications. But this is where the cultural context became relevant, in my view, in how this played out in the American historical experience. Because there was a hierarchy among these various religious sets of beliefs, and there was, in effect, the higher orders of Protestant Christianity had a hegemonic relationship to early Republican America, that it was not possible for someone to emerge as a serious political national political figure unless they were Protestant and preferably Episcopalian or Presbyterian. So you had the exclusions of the others, not formally. In fact, they would be unconstitutional if formalized, but they were in de facto implemented in the society. And then if we come forward to the kind of extraordinary, in one sense, election of Barack Obama in 2008, one notices that the real effort to discredit him was not premised on race, but that he was a closet Muslim. And that a very extensive whispering campaign. So again, the political and cultural context was such that the way to disqualify, or at least the way the opponents of Obama sought to disqualify him, was to refer to his religious identity, not to his race, although that was part of the agenda of those that opposed him. But it was not acceptable to foreground that objection, but it was permissible to foreground the religious objection, the objection as to his religious identity. So that it seems very instructive, I think, to understand that the existence of religious freedom, which has been a staple element of the U.S. Experience as embedded in Article 1 of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and Article 6, which says that religious identity shouldn't be a qualification for a position of public trust. See, in that sense, it would be unconstitutional to object to Obama because he was a Muslim. But at the same time, the living law, so to speak, excluded those that were not part of the Christian mainstream of American society. And even in that Christian mainstream, this hegemonic Protestant culture prevented Catholics from being serious contenders for national leadership until John F. Kennedy in 1960, as late as 1960. And it was seen as a breakthrough when Kennedy was elected. And once you have these breakthroughs, then it seems much less dramatic to have others follow in the footsteps. But the first, creating the precedent is extremely important. In the comments that particularly Sonia made about Islamophobia also are very interesting in the American context, where it is a new challenge that was dramatized, I think, by the 9/11 attacks, but preceded that by several other political events that really created this atmosphere where Islamophobia could have a quasi-respectable status within American society. And those events were the hostage crisis that followed after the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and 80, where Islamic radicals took over the American embassy in Tehran and held American diplomats hostage for, I forget the length of time, it's 380 days or some very long period of time, until the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. The day he was inaugurated, the hostages were released. But the point was that this focus was very instrumental, in my view, in creating a certain political, legal mood in the country. And the other issue was the way in which the Israel-Palestine conflict was presented by film in the popular culture and in the media, where Arabs and Palestinians particularly, were viewed as terrorists. They were presented not as people seeking national liberation or self-determination. They were presented as those that were hijacking planes, suicide bombers, all the iconographic depiction of the Islamic personage that has no respect for the innocence of civilian life as a kind of essential feature. So all of these elements were in the background, and then you had the use by influential religious leaders like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, who took the occasion of 9/11 to stigmatize Islam as the religion of the infidel, as something that should not be tolerated within this domain of religious freedom. That, in other words, there were limits, cultural limits on religious freedom that needed to be respected. And it is that kind of Islamophobia that is embedded then in the larger geopolitics, because unlike France, for instance, the United States is a global state, and this attitude toward the Islamic world was given a kind of prominence in Samuel Huntington's hypothesis of a clash of civilizations. So it was not only the degree to which Islam as a religion was somehow dangerous to American security and American values, but it was also the sense that on a global scale, the history of our times after the Cold War was being rewritten in these intercivilizational struggles, and that the most salient struggle, and happened to be where the energy reserves of the world were also concentrated, was in the Islamic world. And there were always contradictions here. I mean, Saudi Arabia, the most Islamic of political systems, never ceased to be exempt from criticism, despite it having by far the worst record from a human rights perspective toward the treatment of women, but because it was our friend in the region, it was immunized from criticism. So it suggests the primacy of geopolitics for one thing, but it also suggests the degree to which secularism as a part of American identity is always subject to other considerations. It's not treated as a unconditional guideline, either domestically or internationally. And that has generated, I think, a great deal of suspicion about the behavior of the United States as the promoter of human rights around the world, and as a basically embracing double standards. Let me bring these remarks to a close by saying that I think the positive side of the American experience is the sense that throughout the history of the country, there has been a recognition that in order to live well together, given the diversities that exist within the country, there needs to be a strong tradition sponsored by the legal, reinforced by the legal system and by the political leadership of respect for religious diversity and respect for the idea that religious conscience, individual conscience, should include the right to choose the religious orientation that one seeks, that one adheres to. And so the tensions come really from these societal and cultural sources that the government has, and the legal system has tried to mediate and to try to contain. So with the recognition that the basic quality of political life in the country depends on sustaining an atmosphere of religious tolerance and non-discrimination as between religious forms of belief. Let me stop now.
Thanks to all three of you and for responding to each other along the way. There are a couple of questions I thought I'd pose maybe to continue a little bit of conversation before we open it up. And one is that I wonder, in listening to each of you, I really liked the way in which you looked at secularism or laïcité at a number of levels. And I think Sonia first mentioned it sort of at the interpersonal level. Well, actually, that was Islamophobia, but then at the national and also at the international level. And you both picked up on that quite nicely. And I think it's fair to say that you were all critical of laïcité or secularism at some level. But I wonder if you could say whether you see your critique as a critique of the practice, so it's just not living up to its original idea, or whether you have deeper critiques that go to the core of the concepts.
Who's
And
going to
we
answer?
could do it in any order you want.
You start.
Yes, I have no critique against the principle of laïcité, but the real principle. I have a critique against the way it's now used, and we are listening to Hilal. I was thinking that France now is imitating Turkey. Yes. So just we are going just in the way where Turkey went, but the principle of laïcité was a very good principle, and even Muslim believers, deep believers in France, say that they want laïcité. They want that religion to be to be respected. They want freedom because the real principle is freedom of religion. So I have nothing against laicity, but I have something against the authoritarian laicity, or laicity as it was used in the colonial empire to oppress the people. So, well, it's a question of interpretation. That's so in France, it's a big quarrel about that. But that's my answer.
I
The
also,
principle is a very good principle.
yeah, I also agree definitely with Sonia. The principle is good, like any other principles. We can criticize human rights principles too, not because of the principles, but the way in which how they implement and how they manipulate. This is not the only concept that laicite or secularism is sort of twisted by the political power. And the secularism or laicity is very important, not only because of freedom of religion, but also to getting rid of religion from the politics. Because if we don't have a laicity, then we will be completely victimized by the political structure, either very religious or non-religious. I mean, that's a very important principle. The best way is really sort of purely implementing this in a democratic society. In this sense, I think you need a democracy to make it kind of laicite is more respectable principle.
Just a small addition. I think we all share the sense that secularism has been a major contribution, positive contribution in the modern world, and again, against that background of religious warfare, religious efforts by the religious state to impose its will on those that don't share the religious beliefs. And we only have to think about the problems of the non-secular states, like Iran being the most obvious current example, that a theocracy is by its nature incompatible with the granting of human rights to the whole of society, unless you assume a completely homogeneous society. And minorities, for instance, in Iran, have not fared well in the period during this period of theocracy. So either a theocratic state or an ethno-nationalist state that claims only one ethnicity as its defining identity. Neither of those conceptions that are alternatives to secularism seem to me to be acceptable political forms and irreconcilable with the promotion of human rights for the entire citizenry.
Well, I thought I could detect some differences, but I'll maybe we can, with the question and answer, go a little bit further. Maybe just one other thing. I was thinking about the Obama example, and my recollection was that he got into trouble also because of the church he attended, the Christian church, the black church. And so it made me, and the politics of that church, and they went and looked at what the pastor was saying and whatnot. And then also, of course, he was seen as a foreigner. So the Muslim, foreigner, radical black Christian were kind of all operating in some interesting way together. And listening to you all, Islam came up in very different ways in very different times, and often you were reflecting different understandings of it. So I wonder so I heard Islam as religion, I heard within Islam as religion, observant Islam as religion, non-observant Islam maybe as not religion, which means Islam as ethnic category, Islam as transnational, ethnic, religious category, Islam as political category, the terrorist example being one, but only one. You could have all kinds of politics around it. And so I wonder if maybe you could reflect in your examples about which of those understandings seem to be most behind a lot of the concerns that you have, in particular around Islamophobia.
But the one thing that I want to put it, Islam is not the first example, of course. Before Islam, there was a serious kind of anti-Semitism in Europe against Jewish people. That is the very important case historically. Now, this is kind of replaced to Islamophobia. That is not only about Islam. It's something that the religious minority, one way or another, become an important entity. Then in the Christian world, there is always kind of some kind of sensitivity, especially in Europe, that is a center of Christianity. They don't really like these minorities are becoming visible like that. Now, Islam may be negative, may be positive, both ways, a very visible religion. That's the reason I think Islamophobia right now important, but it's not the only.
If I may answer your question and answer also to Hilal, I agree with Hilal. In France, for example, Islamophobia replaced exactly anti-Semitism. It's the same structure of prejudice, but with other people. But France has a long story with Islam since Crusades and even before. So, and a complicated story, which was not always a story of enmity. It was also a story of fascination. So it was complicated. But well, it depends. When I teach on Islam or when I write on Islam, I always try to show the complexity. There are so many Islams, there are so many levels, but Islamophobia is a prejudice, and the prejudice is deeply something very, as Adorno showed it, it's an ideology with many contradictions, with many confusions. It's not clear at all. It's something when everything is mixed. You for example, to wear a veil, when a woman wears a veil because of for her it's the way to find to go some spirituality, then she's immediately a terrorist. So, everything is mixed. I appreciated the way you spoke of AKP as, I noted it, Islam-friendly party. There is no Islam-friendly party when I try to say, we have movement, I say in front, Islamic and Islamist, not at all the same. It's not acceptable. So there is a big confusion, and I think the confusion is a part of it. When there is no confusion, you begin to think, you use your mind, and then you don't have any more prejudice. But the prejudice is a mixture of confusion and of feelings. And that's like, when I study prejudice, I use, there's a theory of dream by Freud, the condensation, and over surdetermination, I don't know, over determination. So everything is mixed and contradictory in the prejudice, like in the dreams. So you can be yourself and somebody else, and it's just the same. So you can, but when you begin to analyze, then it's okay, it's something else.
I think it's well to recall that the two worst abuses of state power, Nazism and Stalinism, were both undertaken by governments that were unfriendly to religion. In other words, it is a qualification on the endorsement of secularism that it can go in a pathological direction under certain political and social and cultural conditions. And it shows the extremities of this modern idea that you can govern without any sensitivity to the broader civilizational values, which for most people are expressed through religion. So that there is a complexity in the relationship between religion and secularism, in which one can argue at least that secularism needs a robust religious tradition in order to avoid these pathological extremes when the society gets under stress.
Great, that was the beginning of the debate I wanted
Controversy.
earlier.
Yes, we disagree on that. This table is disagree.
No, I agree with Richard.
So let me open it up now. Yes, Daniel. Wait, Daniel, could you wait for a second? We have a microphone coming.
Yeah, Professor Elver, you mentioned in the paper you gave us to read, there was an opinion poll by the Pew Center on the public perception of Muslim women wearing full veils in public, and it resulted that in Europe apparently there were overwhelming majorities who approved of a ban on wearing full veils in public, while in the U.S. The opposite was the case. Could you?
Can you speak?
I'm sorry.
louder,
I
please?
can tell you that there is.
The opinion poll that there were several European countries that approved of a ban on Muslim women wearing full veils in public, like 82% in France, 71% in Germany, 62% in Britain, and 59% in Spain. While in the U.S., 65% said they would disapprove of a ban.
Yes.
Could you explain? What are you?
Question is to me, right?
Yeah, like both of you, because.
My explanation on this, a little bit of Richard's presentation, the difference between European understanding and the American understanding of the multiculturalism. And Americans are still multicultural society and kind of immigrant society. They are not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous. And the freedom of religion is extremely important. Even freedom of religion has a lot of problems in the United States, but not as much as in Europe. Europe is more homogeneous, more Christian oriented, and the minority is not as comfortable as in the U.S. This thing's changing maybe, but still, this is a 2012. It's striking that still headscarves are not a big problem for U.S. government. And they will never have a law. It cannot be because it's against the First Amendment. But Europe is much more permissible to sort of make a law against burqas and dealing with this Islamic symbols, also mosques, similar thing. Although mosques issue became an important in Turkey, in the U.S. too, but still it's not a strong governmental orientation except the security areas. If you talk about the FBI, things or the Homeland Security, things would be changing. But if you look at in general perspective, United States is still multicultural, still they believe, and then they protect the religious freedom of each societies. And in the United States, unlike Europe, there is no ghettoization. I mean, you cannot go, oh, this is the Muslim neighborhood, or this city around it, Muslims lives, but not in the center. We are much more in the United States together. Being together means learning more from each other and understanding. There's one anecdote actually in this Pew research. They ask people that they are anti-Muslim in the United States. For instance, they ask, would you like to have Muslim neighbors? And I think 25% said, no, we don't want Muslim neighbor. And they sort of asked, would you like to have gay member? Actually, gay family, more they don't like the gays than the Muslims. That's interesting. The other one, they asked the same group saying that, do you know any Muslim? 100% of this group don't have any Muslim friend. They never seen any Muslim in their life. So that's US.
I saw Sarah's hand. Did you?
This question is also for Professor Elver. In your paper, you mention the margin of appreciation principle and how the European Court of Human Rights was extremely deferential to the Turkish jurisprudence and their decisions. And you mentioned how the court didn't really consider the different situations in the cases, but also like followed the precedent that had set for other cases. And I believe Switzerland was one of the first cases that you talk about. Do you believe that the cases should have come out differently based on these different situations and different countries?
Yeah, I didn't want to go details in the margin of appreciation. Actually, this is a principle that, as I said when I was talking a little bit, the court basically refers to domestic law if its issues is more cultural or kind of religious issues. In this case, they went back to the Turkish constitutional court decision they use completely, but when you use the margin of appreciation, there's a limit on that. A margin of appreciation cannot be used limitless. The limit is whether or not is applicable to democratic society and European kind of ethics, that they never looked at that direction. And the margin of appreciation also has been used other freedom of Article 9 issues. But maybe do you know anything about the Lao-Tzu case? Do they know Lao-Tzu
Just
case?
from your chapter, but most people probably don't. So you should.
Well, after this Leyla Şahin case, which is 2005, and then in 2011, I think 2011, there was a new case, again the Grand Chamber, which is the high level. The first went to the lower level. The case was about using the Christian cross in the high school rooms in Italy. And the mother of the two boys, which I think she was 80s, but she was not Italian, I think, but she was living in Italy. She went to court that she said, I'm an atheist, I don't want my children go under the cross. And then this case all the way went to the European Court of Human Rights. And European Court of Human Rights, in the first level, they said, oh, okay, just like the headscarf case, this is against secularism principle. Then the high schools should take the cross away. This created incredible outcry in Europe. All the Christian countries came together, they protest the European Court of Human Rights, and then the case went to the Grand Chamber. Actually, they used a famous human rights lawyer in NYU. He came with his kappa. He was Andrew, I forgot the name. Andrew Vail or?
Joseph, what? No.
I don't remember the name. He's a Jewish professor, and he sort of made his point very strongly. This is a cultural kind of image, and it is nothing to do with the secularism and this and that. And the court completely changed the decision in favor of Italian government, saying that, oh, this is okay, it's okay in Italy, you can sit in the high school. But then you have to think about it. How do you make these two cases using they use at the end a margin of appreciation, not in the lower level, but the grand chamber level. In this sense, margin of appreciation sometimes is a good, sometimes is not good, but you have to use with another limitations.
Tova?
This question goes kind of back to what you were saying before about Islamophobia kind of replacing anti-Semitism. And I was just wondering if there's been any regulation of headwear that Jewish people wear in Europe, and if not, then how that's reconciled with the secularism arguments they make against Islamic headwear.
Well, that's in French law.
If I can answer, because
Yes.
first,
Ah.
well, the law, the
2004.
2004, of course, it banned the boys who wear kippah, but the difference is a difference of social class, not only of religion. Most Muslims are of very lower class, not the Jewish people. So there are Jewish schools where the boys could go, and the problem is schools for Muslim girls. So and they went. That's a difference. But of course, so they didn't suffer as much as of the law because they had schools for them, and.
But similar thing you can implement to Catholic nuns' headgear, which is the German court made interesting decision about the first. It was a good decision because they said the German constitutional court there is no law to ban headscarf, but the landers can do because it's a federal system. Landers do their own law, and some of the landers rushed in to ban the headscarf. When they ban the headscarf, they even exclude the nuns because they said this is our Occidental culture. We can't really do this. That was an interesting kind of twisting.
Okay, yes, sir.
Please correct my pronunciation as I may butcher it. Professor Falk, you mentioned that theocracy is incompatible with rights, which by short extension sounds like religion X is incompatible with rights. Accepting that premise, how do you answer giving religious groups freedoms, but they're not religious governments? And I don't mean to be nitpicky, but this question attempts to shed light on the contention between group rights and individual rights, especially when governments get involved.
Well, I think it's an important question. The short answer is that when the government becomes the vehicle for a particular religion, and unless everyone within its political jurisdiction adheres to that religion, it isn't a government representing the totality of society. And that is different than respecting the group rights of, let's say, in Iran, Baha'is and Jews were important minorities. There were differences between, there were non-Shia Islamic groups within the society, so that to have some kind of religious freedom prevail within Iran requires, in my judgment, a neutral state, not a state that is itself dedicated to the promotion of a particular religious understanding of reality.
Yes, and then he's had his hand. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for speaking today. Also, Dr. Falk, I would address you with this question. I see the divide in the secular world and the Islamic republics, the ethnic hegemonies that you speak of, as I'll just address religion with this question. it seems that religions issue positions which grant a title to someone within the religion, hence the Pope or an imam, and that title gives them a specific amount of actual legitimate power. And in the West, in a secular political system, the only actual and legitimate power is recognized as the state. And even within secular Western societies, we still have religious organizations that issue titles, if you will, pastors that exercise some bit of authority, but they have no legitimate political authority other than their freedom of speech. How do we reconcile the toleration in a secular or in a non-secular state? How do the people that aren't represented speak for their tolerance, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Well, if I understand you correctly, it's a matter of the degree to which authority within a religious community is reconciled with a legitimate political order. And in that level, I think the American experience is quite positive because it acknowledges that no governmental figure is legitimately entitled to exercise anything remotely resembling religious authority, but it at the same time acknowledges that religions can organize themselves as they wish and have authority structures that reflect their dogma or doctrine. And you have extremes that go from the Catholic relationship to bishops, cardinals, and the Pope, to Quakers that deny any person within the community of believers a special authority position, and that this is all embraced within, I think, a healthy conception of what religious freedom means existentially.
Ben? Right?
Yes. Stand up.
Oh.
Can't see me otherwise. I really have two closely related questions that I think follow from Karen's opening question. And the first one is, when we observe what you describe, I think, as abuses perhaps of the principle of laïcité in France and in Turkey, and one could find complementary examples of the abuse of the First Amendment in the United States, that what we are observing is not the failure of what might be described as enlightened secularism, that is to say, a secularism that actually protects religions and protects from religion and so forth, but rather that's quite simply even the best laws can only do so much work, and that in fact what would be required or needed in order to address the forms of barbarism by religion or barbarism against religion at this point would be something in addition to these actually very good laws, something non-juridical, something extra-juridical, because the juridical can only do so much. Now, that's kind of a rhetorical question, because I assume you'll say yes to that. I think most people would. The real question then, that's my second one, is what can one imagine as forms of social practice, social political practice, that might be able to absorb the residue that cannot be exhausted by purely legal means?
Purely legal means.
Legal means.
Who would like to take that one on?
Now, if you want to do it? A little bit of, we have to, I'm a little confused about this two part of the question. The first part was, you said basically the laws are not perfect, right? And
no, the problem is not the laws. That is to say, the laws are perfectly good, but the laws cannot exhaustively address the problem.
yes.
Yes,
And
but that-
therefore, we also need extra legal efforts.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
But you know, all the laws are not good. You can have very bad laws when you have an exceptional law. It's not a good law, so it's not a real law. And what the point with the French situation is that now laïcité is a new religion, and it tends to be the only religion of the state. You know, it tends to replace what Catholic religion was in the 18th or in the 17th century. So it creates some sort of totalitarian state. So that and a totalitarian state also has laws, but these laws are bad, and these laws are bad because they just want to oppress a part of the population. So we want the empowerment of women. We think that Muslim women are agents. We want to respect the agency, and so that's the point. And we don't want laws who oppress them. So it's not a question. It's the laws of Nuremberg were not good laws, and there were laws, you know. So that's the point. What's that? Perhaps I didn't understand what you said. The point is laïcité as a religion now, and not as a principle like democracy is a principle. Laïcité, secularism has to be a principle to be respected, but not a new religion to replace the ancient religion and to be in to be the only reference. And something which is in reality atheism. That's the French situation. In France, if you are a believer, you are somebody very queer. So that's like it was during the Stalinian period. So that's a real problem.
I sort of interpreted your law as a kind of jurisprudential way of dealing with the law, right? Am I right? Because you can do very good law, but in implementation you fail. In order to make the law is a good law is not enough to solve the problem, but the whole societal kind of process should really make clear this law should be implemented. Bad laws sometimes, they born as a bad law, and because it is too bad law, you don't implement them, and then they die. In this sense, a judicial process is very important, and the judicial activism is very important in my case. But the judicial activism is completely connected with the social and political structure. We can go in a very good way, or we can really fail it. In this sense, I totally agree with you. Making a law, for instance, this laws in 2004 is a bad law. It is not a good law. But secularism, maybe it's a good law, but implemented wrongly, or maybe it will change. But the social powers, of course, extra legal area. When you say extra legal, you also include the judicial power, or just the legislation. That's also different. You know, there's a legislation and the courts, and plus the social kind of structure. In this sense, they have kind of worked together if it is democratic society.
Let me just add a word. It seemed to me that your initial premise that one can't expect the law to do all the work is very similar to what I was trying to express by saying the cultural context is crucial to the fulfillment of the objectives of the law. And another way of formulating this is to say that if you want to realize the values of secularism or the values that are associated with the laws protecting religious freedom, it has to have some congruence with the living law of society. And if the living law is hegemonic or prejudicial, the legality is not sufficient to change behavior. And then the other part of the question is, what can you do about that problem? And it seems to me one thing you can do is try to influence the nature of civic education, how people learn to be citizens within a multicultural constitutional democracy. And I think an important way they do is to understand the place of religious freedom within that constitutional framework. And that would be some protection against the kind of anti-Islamophobic reactions to 9/11 and other forms of experience.
So we don't have a lot of time left, so I think I'll just take a few questions and then let everyone respond. So I know, Ben Brower, you had your hand up a while.
I'll try to be quick. On a question to pick back up with...
Can you just wait for the mic?
To pick back up with your question about principle and practice, you know, I think that what I'm hearing here from the panelists is deep belief in the principle and skepticism in the ability of you know, political institutions to realize it in practice. And I think, you know, in some ways, just to sort of clarify the terrain a little bit for myself, and maybe this will be helpful for other people, you know, I think there's a body of scholarship on secularism that would say, indeed, that the principle itself will never have an emancipatory effect, that it will only lead to normative projects. By that, you know, I'm thinking of people like Tal al-Assad, Charles Taylor, you know, the critiques, the sharp critics of secularism. It'll never have an emancipatory effect, but only a normative effect that'll lead to exclusion and exception and so forth. In many ways, I think that that's a fairly solid argument if you look historically at it. But what I'll show you is an example that supports the ideals that the principles, there are different ways to excavate the principles and reappropriate them that might be useful. And this comes from a particular historical case that I'm working on now in colonial Algeria, the colonial period itself. And you know, the sort of the received wisdom of secularism in Islamic societies, as articulated by people like Bernard Lewis, but also people, you know, you sort of think of friends of Muslims like Louis Massignon or Muhammad Arkoun, is that Islamic societies did not secularize. They always sort of take Turkey out of the equation when they say this, but the Islamic societies did not secularize, and this is the roots of Muslim rage or what went wrong. Now, if you look at colonial Algeria, again, what you find is, particularly after 1905, a call from Muslim reformists, modernist reformists, people that sort of came out of the Islamic reform movement further east, people who sort of saw the same genealogy as the Salafiyya movements today, are in fact calling for secularism in a term of separation of church, we might put in quotation marks, church and state. What they want is the French colonial state disinvests itself from the religious field. And to do that, to make that call, I mean, this is an anti-colonial project. This is also a project in which they are trying to re-Islamicize society based on orthodox principles. So it's also a project that will go against Sufism practices, for example. It has a disciplinary project in its own. But what they do is they call back to, again, to these sorts of European principles in this sense, as a way to use secularism against the French state, as it were, in this particular respect. And so I think it's, you know, it's interesting when you sort of trace this out historically, as well as through the concepts and through the theory, and sort of sort this out where you end up with.
Okay, so we did have a couple of hands up, so can we do 30-second questions? Lynn, Dan, and Amanda, and then, but you can start with Amanda since the mic's down there.
So I'd like to know more about the Muslim populations and maybe how they see secularism and laicite. And is there any difference in their viewpoints based on how long certain populations have been in Europe, and also as a way to differentiate themselves from maybe new immigrants because of the demographic pressure that is on European countries, and I guess just what we see now and what could possibly become.
Different question.
Okay, now I should say, how about 30-second questions that require a 30-second answer?
All right. Professor Elver, in your writing, you state that European Court of Human Rights judges are finding it difficult to move outside of the Christian and secular religious and political paradigms that predominate in Europe. And so I was just wondering what you and Professor Dayan-Herzbrun would like to see from the ECHR in the future regarding these kinds of freedom of religious expression cases in the way of analysis, or perhaps them being more regionally specific or based on the principles of the European Convention, so that they are more representative of the reality of the population.
All right. Thank you. And Dan, do you want your...
What struck me about the panel, I'll try to keep it to 30 seconds. What struck me about the panel is that we have a really nice comparison. We have a situation in which there's a sort of dominant, mostly secular majority trying to repress the religious expression of a minority. Then we have a sort of very powerful minority trying to suppress the religious expression of a majority. And then we have the US, in which the sort of religious majority feels like it's being excluded by a sort of overly secular state, and a religious minority that feels like it's being discriminated against by an overly religious society. And so, you know, in the US, the religious majority thinks it lives in France, and the religious minority thinks it lives in Turkey. And I was wondering if actually we shouldn't come up with different models of secularism or laicite for different societies. In other words, how do we think about this? Does a state that actually represents a very religious majority, is there some principle of democracy that says actually that state maybe should reflect the deeply held beliefs of its population, on the one hand? On the other hand, should we say, well, actually that state needs to be more restrained because it's more likely to impose on the religious beliefs of its included minorities?
Great. I think maybe we'll go reverse order, and you all can each pick up on whichever one you want, and there will be time to chat afterward as well.
Yes, let me just briefly respond to the very stimulating last question that was posed. And I think there's no doubt that there is and should be different models for different societal and cultural circumstances. There's a very interesting essay written by an Indian scholar, Rajiv Bhargava, talking about the fact that Western secularism doesn't work for India. And his argument is that to understand how the state should respect religious diversity depends on cultural sensitivity, and that the Indian civilizational setting is one that's much more comfortable with contradictory affirmations at the same time. But the basic argument is you need to be contextual with respect to the conditions that prevail in any society. And the three countries that we've been talking about, I think, have very different histories, have very different national cultures, and very different political challenges that make a secular response to be adequate, it has to be sensitive to those differences.
Then all the answers are comes to me. The first, I think yours is a kind of extensive comment, but I want to say a little bit about the Talal Assad's works. He really criticized the Western, basically how Westerners are looking at the Islamic world and trying to criticize and make some kind of sense, but exactly political issues are very important in relation to making a interpretation about the secularism in Muslim societies. And he gives an example of Turkey in relation to the European Union. And he was saying that Turkey was centuries, was a sort of seen by Europe as the enemy of Europe during the Ottoman Empire. And this feeling never changed. And over again, and during the European Union period in 1992, 2002, when Turkey became kind of candidate, rather than what is going on exactly interpreting Turkey as a state, they saw Turkey as a Muslim enemy country. If you look at from this perspective, even the theory is kind of together with the politics comes. From here, I come to Bernard Lewis' writings, and he is very kind of in his writing, he's a great scholar. I can't really deny his scholarly work, but in his book, The What Went Wrong, it's a completely political answer to Islamic societies. In this sense, sometimes we all maybe do use our feelings and ideologies when we write and interpret things. I'm sure you agree on that. Coming to the new old Muslims in Europe, of course there are several of immigrant society right now in the Europe, maybe 3-4 generation. All of them are different than each other. What I basically know, the older generation was much more secular, non-religious, but the coming to new generation is becoming more kind of culturally, religiously oriented to their identity because of the exclusion of the European societies. But this is very, very general answer. It's not going to be, maybe you can do it like that. The other one is European Court of Human Rights. I think you did write this remark, which it was interesting. Should European Court of Human Rights has a Muslim judge? Yes, they have a Muslim judge. Actually, this decision, Leyla Şahin decision, written by the Turkish judge. In this sense, not about Islam, but how do you interpret secularism and your own, my also answer related to kind of ideological standpoint of peoples are very important to make the decision. They had the Muslim judge, and basically they referred to the judge to write the case, and the decision came kind of a crazy way. In this sense, it's a little difficult to make it completely basically European Court of Human Rights. They're not crazy about putting Muslims in it. Turkey is the only Muslim country being member, as far as I know, to the European Court of Human Rights, which is only they have one judge. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to know that, to say that it was not, for me, it was not a question of religion, it was a question of visibility and of acceptation, the fait to acceptation. For example, in the 60s, we have very powerful trade unions and they support the Muslim workers in the factories who asked for a a mosque, a room where to pray in the factories using Renault and all that. So it was not, but they were not so visible. But I should like to give a philosophical conclusion. I think it's, now the time came to put an end to the cultural imperialism and to be aware of the diversity, because laïcité is something which went out of the Catholic of the Catholicism. It's a concept. It's a Catholic concept. Laïc is the opposite of the cleric, and it has a sense in a country like my country, was a cultural Catholic. Catholic culture, but I think the problem now it's to live with diversity, and I like very much the concept of Paul Gilroy of conviviality. We have to be as host people around the table, so we have to think of. Build something new because the danger, what I feel in my country, but it's an inner problem, but I think it's also an international problem. It's some cultural, social war. And that's we have to learn not multiculturality, because people are they're not in separate culture. They are living together with all sorts of hybridity, mixing together and inventing new ways of being. But we must learn, try to find a way to live together. In the world, in our own countries, and in the world, and that's very, very new. And that's what I think.
Well, this is hard to close down, but I want to say that, and obviously people would stay for another 2 hours, but maybe you can't all. So everyone here is speaking again tomorrow, and they're handing out sheets with the information on that. So please join me now in thanking these speakers for a terrific discussion. Thank you very much.